They said a woman like her should be grateful for scraps. But that night the scraps caught fire. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the Whitmore family's annual winter gala, the crystal chandeliers blazing above a ballroom large enough to swallow a modest 2,500-square-foot house, while her nieces, Madeline and Charlotte, leaned close behind their silk fans and whispered just loud enough to be heard. Poor Spinster Aunt, 32 and still unwanted, living off family charity, as though Clara's steady hands had not balanced their late father's debts down to the last dollar, as though her own dowry had not quietly disappeared to save this very estate from foreclosure. She kept her chin level, fingers resting lightly around the stem of a champagne glass she did not drink, because dignity, she had learned, required less noise than humiliation. Across the polished marble floor, conversations shimmered like fragile glass, laughter rising and falling in polite waves, and then the front doors opened to a rush of cold December air, carrying with it the unmistakable presence of Duke Julian Ashford, the most desired bachelor in 3 states, a man whose name alone could shift the stock prices of half the county, his dark suit cut with severe elegance, his expression unreadable as he stepped inside. The music faltered for a breath, and in that breath Clara felt the weight of 100 curious eyes shift from him to her, because everyone knew the Ashfords did not attend events without purpose. Madeline's whisper sharpened. Perhaps he has come to find a real bride, not a relic, and a few nearby guests suppressed smiles behind gloved hands. Clara's pulse fluttered once, then steadied, because she had survived worse than laughter. She had survived broken promises, a suitor who withdrew when he learned her inheritance had been used to cover her brother's reckless investments, the long years of watching opportunities close like doors in a storm. Duke Ashford paused midway, across the ballroom, his gaze traveling over the crowd until it found her, and when it did not slide away. It lingered, not with pity, not with amusement, but with something quieter, sharper, as though he were measuring not her gown, modest and last season, but the way she carried herself beneath the scrutiny. Clara felt it like a current against her skin, unexpected and unwelcome, because attention from a man like him could be more dangerous than neglect. Charlotte laughed softly. See how she stares, as if she could ever belong in his world, and Clara finally turned, meeting her niece's smirks with a calm that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Belonging was a luxury she had long ago stopped chasing. Survival was not. Yet as Duke Ashford began walking toward her, each deliberate step echoing across the marble like a promise about to be broken or fulfilled, Clara sensed that the careful balance she had maintained for years was about to tilt, and for the first time since becoming the family's convenient afterthought, she wondered whether humiliation had a limit, or whether this night would push her beyond it. The murmur in the ballroom thinned into a fragile silence as Duke Julian Ashford stopped exactly 3 feet from Clara Whitmore, close enough that she could see the faint reflection of chandelier light in his dark eyes, yet far enough to preserve every rule of propriety. And for a suspended moment neither of them spoke. He inclined his head, not to the room, but to her, a gesture so precise and deliberate that it unsettled the careful hierarchy her nieces had relied upon all evening, and Clara felt the shift ripple outward like a stone dropped into still water. Madeline recovered first, gliding forward with a smile polished to perfection. Your Grace, what an honor for our family. We were just speaking about eligible matches this season, and her emphasis on the last words was sharp as glass. Julian's gaze did not move from Clara when he answered. I find that the most interesting conversations are rarely the loudest ones, and the quiet authority in his tone made several nearby guests straighten instinctively. Clara forced herself to breathe evenly, aware that every whisper now pivoted around them, aware that one misstep would confirm every cruel assumption ever made about her. She lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission but in thought, then lifted them again to meet his without flinching. Your Grace, she said, her voice steady and low, I hope you are enjoying the evening. It was a simple sentence, yet beneath it lay years of discipline, of learning to speak without revealing how often she had been dismissed. He studied her as though measuring something invisible, and for the first time she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Whether he saw the faded silk of her gown or the quiet ledger books she had balanced long after midnight to keep this estate from collapsing under unpaid taxes, Charlotte stepped closer, laughter soft and practiced. Aunt Clara has always been devoted to family obligations, sometimes at the expense of her own prospects. But of course some women are simply not meant for grand romances. The words were light, almost playful, yet their intention was not. Clara felt the familiar sting, the old narrative tightening around her like a corset pulled too firm. She opened her mouth to deflect the comment, to smooth the edges as she always did, but Julian spoke first. Devotion is rarely the mark of insignificance, he said evenly, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. His eyes shifted at last to the nieces, and though his expression remained composed, something resolute flickered beneath it. I have found that the people who hold families together are often the ones history forgets to applaud. The statement hung in the air, unmistakable. Madeline's smile faltered by a fraction of an inch. Clara's pulse quickened, not from triumph but from uncertainty, because attention from a man of his stature was not a passing courtesy. It was a decision, and decisions from men like him altered entire futures. She sensed that this was no accidental exchange in a crowded ballroom, that he had not crossed the marble floor merely to offer polite admiration. Beneath the glow of crystal lights and the hum of expensive perfume, something far more deliberate was unfolding, and Clara realized with a steadying breath that the story her family had written about her might not survive the night. The silence that followed his words did not feel accidental. It felt chosen, as if Duke Julian Ashford had placed it there with careful precision, and Clara Whitmore understood in that instant that retreat was no longer an option. The orchestra resumed softly in the corner of the ballroom, violins weaving a polite melody that did nothing to ease the tension coiled beneath the chandeliers, and guests pretended to return to their conversations while listening to every breath exchanged between them. Julian extended his hand, not possessively, but as one might offer an equal invitation. Miss Whitmore, may I have the honor of a dance? It was a simple request, perfectly respectable. Yet the effect was seismic. Madeline's fan stilled midair, Charlotte's smile froze, and Clara felt the entire room tilt toward her answer. She had not danced in 3 years, not since the last suitor quietly withdrew after learning that her inheritance had already been poured into rescuing her brother's failing investments, and she remembered the look on that man's face, polite disappointment masking calculation. She remembered standing alone on a different marble floor, realizing that practicality always outweighed affection. Now Julian's hand waited, steady and unhurried, as though he possessed all the time in the world. You may decline, he added quietly. His voice meant only for her, and there was no challenge in it, only respect. That, more than the invitation itself, unsettled her. Clara placed her gloved fingers into his palm, aware of the warmth through the thin fabric, aware that the smallest gesture could be misread, and allowed him to guide her onto the dance floor. The waltz carried them in measured circles, 3 steps forward, 1 turn, 3 steps back, the polished floor reflecting light like still water. He did not draw her too close, did not assume familiarity, and for the first time in years Clara felt seen without being examined. You do not seem surprised by their opinion of you, he observed after a few turns. I have lived with it long enough, she replied, her tone calm. It no longer requires my reaction. Most people fight harder to defend themselves, he said. Most people still expect to win, she answered. His gaze sharpened at that, not with pity but with interest. The music swelled, skirts brushing softly against dark suits, and Clara became acutely aware of the stares that followed them like shadows. Do you believe them? He asked, his voice lower now. Believe what? Your Grace. That you are insignificant. She met his eyes fully then, the steady gray of his gaze reflecting something unspoken. I believe, she said after a beat, that some sacrifices are easier to mock than to acknowledge. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist, not in control but in understanding. When the final note faded and applause scattered lightly through the room, he did not release her immediately. Instead he turned, guiding her toward the center of the ballroom rather than back to the safety of the perimeter, and Clara sensed the deliberate nature of the movement. Madeline stepped forward again, intent on reclaiming attention, but Julian's voice carried clearly above the murmurs. "There is something I would like to address this evening," he announced, and the quiet that followed was no longer fragile. It was absolute. Clara felt her pulse thunder once against her ribs, because she knew with sudden certainty that whatever he intended to say would redraw the lines of her life in ways she could not yet comprehend. Every whisper in the ballroom seemed to draw inward as Duke Julian Ashford released Clara Whitmore's hand and stepped half a pace ahead of her, not to shield her, but to stand beside her in full view of the crowd. Crystal light shimmered across the polished marble, catching on the silver threads of gowns and the sharp edges of tailored suits. Yet no one moved. No one dared interrupt. Julian's voice carried without strain, calm and measured. "I have attended many gatherings in this house over the years, and I have heard much about loyalty, legacy, and family pride. And tonight I have observed something else entirely." A faint ripple moved through the guests, the sound of breath drawn and held. Madeline's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. Charlotte's chin lifted in brittle defiance, but neither spoke. Clara felt the weight of 100 eyes press against her back, felt the old instinct urging her to step aside, to minimize herself before the tide turned cruel. Yet she remained. Where she was, spine straight, shoulders steady. Julian continued, "It is curious how easily we dismiss the person who has carried the quiet burdens. How quickly we label sacrifice as failure." His gaze swept the room deliberately before settling on the Whitmore nieces. "I have taken the time to understand the history of this estate, the debts that once threatened it, the investments that faltered, the property taxes that nearly forced a sale 3 winters ago." Several guests exchanged startled looks, because such matters were rarely spoken aloud in polite society. Clara's pulse stumbled, her breath catching at the realization that he knew. He knew. Madeline found her voice first. "Your Grace, surely this is not the appropriate moment to discuss private family affairs." Julian inclined his head slightly. Appropriateness is often determined by comfort, and comfort is rarely extended to those who deserve it most. The words fell with quiet precision. He turned toward Clara then, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with unmistakable intent. Miss Whitmore surrendered her inheritance to preserve this family's name. She balanced accounts no one else wished to examine. She absorbed blame that did not belong to her. The murmurs grew louder now, no longer amused but unsettled. Charlotte's smile fractured completely. Clara felt heat rise beneath her skin, not from shame, but from exposure. Because her sacrifices had never been meant as currency. They had been necessary, nothing more. Julian took one measured step closer, lowering his voice so that it remained audible yet intimate. "You were never insignificant, Clara. You were simply convenient." The statement cut deeper than any insult ever had. For a moment she could not speak. The orchestra had fallen silent again, as if even the musicians sensed the shift unfolding. Madeline laughed too brightly, attempting recovery. "My aunt has always exaggerated her role in family matters. Without us she would have nothing." Julian's expression did not change, but something resolute hardened beneath it. "Without her," he replied evenly, "this house would not be standing." And for the first time that evening the balance of power visibly shifted. Clara saw it in the way guests avoided her niece's eyes, in the subtle retreat of former allies. Julian extended his hand once more, not for a dance this time, but as a declaration. "Clara," he said clearly, "I would like everyone here to understand precisely who you are before this night ends." And in that charged stillness, she understood that whatever came next would not merely defend her dignity, it would redefine it. The room felt smaller than its measured dimensions, as though the walls themselves had leaned inward to listen. And Clara Whitmore became acutely aware of the steady rise and fall of her own breath, while Duke Julian Ashford's outstretched hand remained between them, patient and unwavering. This was no impulsive gesture, no fleeting defense spoken out of chivalry. It was something deliberate, something chosen. She placed her fingers lightly into his palm once more, not because she needed rescue, but because she refused to retreat. Julian turned slightly, so that they faced the gathered guests together, and his voice carried with calm authority. "There are moments when silence becomes a form of injustice, and tonight I will not remain silent." A ripple of tension moved through the ballroom. Madeline attempted another brittle laugh. Surely this is all unnecessary. But the confidence had drained from her tone. Julian did not look at her. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a folded document, crisp and official, bearing the discreet watermark of a financial firm recognized by half the county. 3 winters ago, he continued evenly, Whitmore Estate faced foreclosure due to mismanaged investments and unpaid obligations. The necessary funds that prevented its collapse did not come from an outside benefactor, nor from successful ventures by its heirs. They came from Miss Clara Whitmore. A collective intake of breath swept the room. Clara felt heat bloom across her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the exposure of something she had never intended to publicize. Julian unfolded the document just enough to display the formal seal. This record confirms the transfer of her personal inheritance, totaling $180,000, into the estate's recovery account. Without it, this ballroom would not exist in its current splendor. Charlotte's composure fractured entirely. That was her choice. She insisted sharply. She had no other prospects. Julian's gaze shifted at last, cool and unyielding. Sacrifice is not the same as lack of prospects, he replied, and generosity does not equate to failure. The distinction seemed to echo against the marble floor. Clara's heart pounded once, hard, because the truth he spoke carried both vindication and vulnerability. She had given that money without expectation of gratitude. She had given it because someone had to. Julian folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket. I have spent the past year evaluating philanthropic partnerships in this county, he said, and I make my decisions based on integrity and character. If those qualities are to guide my personal life as well, then I will not allow them to be dismissed as insignificant. He turned fully toward Clara then, and the shift in his posture altered the very air between them. I would like to make something equally clear. The orchestra stood motionless, bows suspended midair. The guests held their breath. Clara felt the fragile edge of possibility tremble beneath her ribs. Julian's voice softened, yet carried to every corner of the ballroom. Clara Whitmore is not a burden to this family. She is its foundation. And I have no intention of allowing her worth to remain unrecognized. The words settled into silence like the final note of a symphony. And in that charged stillness, Clara understood that whatever he was about to say next would not merely challenge the narrative written about her. It would replace it entirely. The air did not move. Even the chandeliers seemed suspended in breathless anticipation as Duke Julian Ashford held Clara Whitmore's gaze. And in that fragile pause, she understood that the next word spoken would either anchor her to the margins forever or pull her into a life she had never permitted herself to imagine. He did not rush, did not seek applause. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm enough to be mistaken for inevitability. I have built my name on discernment, he said, choosing carefully where I invest my trust, my resources, and my future, and I do not place those investments where there is weakness. The statement traveled across the ballroom like a measured current. Clara felt her pulse against her throat, steady but undeniable. Madeline shifted, preparing another protest. Yet something in Julian's composure silenced her before she began. I have seen enough of society to recognize that admiration is often loud, he continued, but respect is quiet, and I have found more strength in the woman standing beside me tonight than in many who compete for my attention. Clara's breath caught softly, not from flattery, but from the clarity of his tone. He was not embellishing. He was stating a conclusion. Charlotte attempted to recover the room with brittle politeness. Your Grace, surely such praise is generous but unnecessary. Julian turned slightly, his expression unwavering. What is unnecessary is the habit of diminishing someone whose contribution exceeds your own. The words settled with deliberate precision. A faint tremor of realization passed through the guests. Alliances shifted without a single overt movement. Clara felt the old instinct urging her to deflect, to reduce the moment before it grew dangerous. Yet something steadier rose within her, something long restrained. Julian stepped forward then, not away from the crowd, but deeper into its center. And to Clara's astonishment, he lowered himself onto one knee upon the polished marble floor. The collective gasp was audible, sharp as a drawn breath. He did not dramatize the gesture. He did not glance around to measure reaction. His attention remained solely on her. Clara Whitmore, he said clearly, so that every corner of the ballroom could hear. I do not kneel out of impulse or spectacle. I kneel because I have chosen. I have chosen the woman whose loyalty is proven, whose strength is unwavering, whose integrity does not depend upon applause. He extended his hand upward toward her, steady and certain. I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife. Silence fell in absolute form, heavy and complete. Clara felt the world narrow to the space between them, to the distance of 12 inches separating her gloved fingers from his. She saw shock fracture her niece's composure, saw former allies retreat into stunned quiet. Yet none of it carried the weight of his gaze. This was not rescue. It was recognition. Her heart pounded once, twice, then steadied with a resolve she had not known she possessed. She stepped forward, closing the measured distance, and though she had not yet spoken, the entire ballroom understood that the narrative they had constructed about her was dissolving before their eyes. The silence stretched so thin it felt breakable, and Clara Whitmore realized that every breath in the ballroom depended on her next word. Duke Julian Ashford remained on one knee before her, composed and unwavering, his hand extended not as a command but as an invitation, and in his steady gaze she saw no calculation, no performance, only certainty. The chandeliers above cast warm light across the polished marble floor, reflecting in the stunned faces of guests who had gathered expecting spectacle and found themselves witnessing something far rarer. Clara's pulse beat once against her ribs, strong and deliberate, and she understood that this moment was not about rescue but about choice. She lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission but in reflection, recalling the nights she had sat alone at a mahogany desk balancing ledgers until dawn, the letters she had written negotiating extensions on loans, the quiet humiliation she had endured so that others could remain comfortable. She had never asked to be seen. She had only asked to be useful. And yet here he was, kneeling in full view of the same society that had dismissed her. Madeline's voice trembled through the silence. Aunt Clara, you must not be impulsive. This is highly irregular. But the protest lacked conviction. Charlotte's composure had dissolved entirely, her carefully rehearsed charm reduced to tight lips and wide eyes. Clara lifted her gaze and met Julian's fully. Your Grace, she began softly, and the room leaned closer. You honor me beyond measure, but I do not accept proposals born of pity. The words were steady, clear, and unmistakable. A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Julian's expression did not waver. I would never insult you with pity, he replied calmly. I am offering partnership. I am offering respect. I am offering the certainty that I recognize what others have chosen to overlook. His voice held no urgency, only truth. Clara searched his face for hesitation and found none. Instead, she saw resolve anchored by admiration. She stepped closer, the soft rustle of her gown echoing lightly in the vast ballroom. I will not be your redemption story, she continued, because I do not need redemption. And for the first time a hint of warmth touched his features. Nor would I ask you to be, he said quietly. You would be my equal. The simplicity of that promise cut deeper than any grand declaration could have. Clara felt the fragile barrier she had built over years begin to shift, not crumble, but open. She extended her hand at last, not trembling, not uncertain. If I accept, she said, her voice carrying through the silent room, it will be because I choose you as well. A subtle exhale passed through the guests. Julian rose smoothly to his feet, closing the small distance between them, and though he did not pull her closer, the air itself seemed to draw tight with significance. Then choose me, Clara, he answered softly, and in that luminous stillness, beneath the crystal light and the watchful eyes of an entire society forced to reconsider its judgment, she made the decision that would forever alter the story they had written about her. The decision did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It arrived with breath, steady and deliberate. As Clara Whitmore lifted her chin beneath the crystal light and allowed the silence to hold her without fear, she looked at Duke Julian Ashford not as a man kneeling in grand declaration, but as the one person in the room who had seen her without distortion. I choose you, she said, her voice clear enough to travel the length of the ballroom, and the words felt less like surrender and more like reclamation. A ripple moved through the gathered guests, sharp and stunned, as though the air itself had shifted direction. Julian's hand closed gently around hers, not possessive, not triumphant, simply certain, and when he rose fully to his feet beside her, they stood as equals in the center of the marble floor. Applause did not begin immediately. Society did not know how to respond when the expected narrative fractured. Madeline's expression hardened, the composure she had worn all evening slipping into something raw. "This is absurd," she insisted, her voice carrying farther than intended. "You cannot be serious." Charlotte's agreement came in a hurried whisper. "This will ruin our standing." Clara felt the old sting of dismissal attempt to rise again, but it faltered beneath the weight of her own resolve. "Our standing," she repeated calmly, turning toward her nieces for the first time that evening without hesitation, "has depended on silence for too long." The words were not sharp, but they were final. Julian did not interrupt. He did not shield her from the confrontation. He allowed her space to speak. "I gave what I had because this family needed it," Clara continued, "not because I lacked worth. And I accepted your laughter because I believed dignity required patience." Her gaze did not waver. "But patience is not the same as invisibility." A hush followed, deeper than before. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing in her voice a truth they had chosen to ignore. Julian's thumb brushed lightly against the back of her gloved hand, a quiet acknowledgment rather than reassurance. Madeline attempted one final protest. "You would leave us for this spectacle." Clara's expression softened, but did not retreat. "I am not leaving you," she replied. "I am leaving the version of myself that allowed you to diminish me." The statement settled with measured clarity. Julian inclined his head slightly toward the orchestra, and after a hesitant pause the musicians resumed, the melody tentative at first, then fuller, as though the room itself were adjusting to a new rhythm. Guests began to murmur once more, but the tone had changed. Admiration replaced amusement. Respect replaced dismissal. Clara felt it in the way eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with reconsideration. Julian turned to her, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "There will be challenges ahead. Society rarely forgives its own misjudgments." She met his gaze without hesitation. "I do not require forgiveness. I require partnership." A faint smile touched his expression, subtle and genuine. "Then we begin as equals." He lifted her hand with quiet formality, not to display but to honor, and as they moved across the marble floor together, no longer at its edges but at its center, Clara understood that the greatest transformation of the night was not the proposal itself. It was the unmistakable shift in how she now stood within her own story. The music swelled with renewed confidence, and for the first time that evening the rhythm did not feel forced. It felt earned. Clara Whitmore moved beside Duke Julian Ashford through the center of the ballroom, her hand resting in his with steady assurance, and she sensed the recalibration happening in real time. Conversations resumed, but their tone had shifted from amused curiosity to thoughtful reconsideration. Several prominent guests approached with measured congratulations, not exaggerated, not theatrical, but sincere. Clara noticed the subtle difference in their posture, the way they now addressed her directly rather than glancing past her shoulder. Respect, she realized, did not announce itself loudly. It simply rearranged the room. Julian leaned slightly closer as they paused near the grand windows overlooking the snow-dusted grounds, his voice low yet clear. "Are you certain?" he asked, not doubting but confirming. "I am certain of myself," she replied, "and that is enough." The honesty in her tone seemed to satisfy him more than any romantic declaration. Across the ballroom, Madeline and Charlotte stood isolated despite the crowd around them. Their earlier confidence had dissolved into tight expressions and whispered consultations. Clara felt no triumph in the sight, only a calm clarity. She had not sought to diminish them. She had simply refused to remain diminished. An older gentleman who had once dismissed her as impractical now bowed slightly in greeting. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology for underestimating your stewardship of this estate." Clara accepted the acknowledgment with quiet grace. "There is no debt between us," she answered. "We all see clearly when we choose to." Julian observed the exchange with restrained admiration, recognizing that her strength required no embellishment. The orchestra transitioned into a slower melody, and guests returned to the dance floor in cautious pairs. The evening, which had begun as spectacle, was reshaping itself into something steadier. Clara felt the weight of her past loosen, not erased, but reframed. For years she had stood at the margins of rooms like this, useful yet unseen. Now she stood at the center not because she had been rescued, but because she had been recognized. Julian's hand shifted slightly, his thumb brushing the edge of her glove in a subtle gesture of partnership. Tomorrow will bring its own scrutiny, he said quietly. Headlines, speculation, perhaps resistance. Clara met his gaze with unwavering calm. I have lived with scrutiny for a decade. What I have not lived with is acknowledgment. The faintest smile touched his expression. Then let acknowledgment be our foundation. Beyond the tall windows, the estate grounds stretched under winter light. 12 acres of land preserved through sacrifices few had noticed. Clara allowed herself a slow breath, understanding that the future would not be simple, but it would be chosen. When the final notes of the melody faded and applause rose once more, it did not celebrate spectacle, it honored resolve. And as Clara Whitmore stood beside the man who had seen her, clearly before the world did, she realized that the most profound transformation of the night was not society's approval. It was her own unwavering acceptance of her worth. The evening did not dissolve into chaos as some might have predicted. Instead, it settled into a quieter, more deliberate current, as though the ballroom itself had recalibrated around a new axis. Clara Whitmore stood beside Duke Julian Ashford near the tall arched windows, the snow beyond reflecting pale light across the 12 acres of Whitmore land that she had fought silently to preserve. And for the first time she felt the estate not as a burden on her shoulders, but as a chapter closing. With dignity, guests approached in measured succession, offering congratulations that were careful rather than extravagant, their earlier assumptions reshaping into cautious respect. A woman who had once introduced Clara merely as helpful now addressed her by name with genuine regard. The difference was subtle, yet unmistakable. Julian accepted each greeting with composed assurance, never tightening his hold on Clara's hand, never speaking for her, allowing her presence to command its own authority. Across the ballroom, Madeline attempted to gather a circle of allies, her gestures animated, her smile strained, yet the cluster thinned quickly. Charlotte stood rigid beside her, the confidence that had fueled their whispers replaced by an awareness they could not conceal. Clara felt no surge of triumph at their isolation. She felt clarity. She had not conquered them. She had simply outgrown their narrative. The orchestra shifted to a restrained waltz, the tempo steady and dignified, and couples returned to the floor with a new attentiveness, as though the night demanded composure rather than spectacle. Julian turned slightly toward Clara, his voice low but unwavering. There will be questions tomorrow. Some will doubt. Some will speculate. Clara met his gaze calmly. Let them. I have answered doubt for years without raising my voice. I can answer it now without lowering my head. His expression softened in quiet admiration. You understand the weight that comes with my name. She did not hesitate. I understand the weight of silence. Your name does not frighten me. Invisibility did. The honesty of her reply seemed to anchor something deeper between them. A respected businessman approached, clearing his throat gently. Your Grace, Miss Whitmore, I believe I owe this estate an apology for past misjudgments. Clara inclined her head, not accepting blame nor assigning it. Understanding is more valuable than apology. He nodded, chastened yet sincere, and stepped aside. Julian's thumb brushed the edge of her glove again, subtle and grounding. Outside these walls, he said, partnership requires resilience. Clara allowed herself a faint smile. Resilience is not new to me. Only recognition is. The final dance of the evening drew to a close, and applause rose not as thunder but as acknowledgment. The chandeliers shimmered above them, no longer symbols of scrutiny, but of illumination. Clara glanced once more across the marble floor that had witnessed her quiet endurance, and now bore witness to her chosen future. When Julian offered his arm to escort her from the center of the room, she accepted not as a woman rescued, but as a woman resolved. And as they walked together beneath the softened glow of crystal light, the story that had once confined her dissolved completely, replaced by one she had chosen. With steady certainty, the final guests drifted toward the exits in clusters of subdued conversation, the great double doors opening and closing beneath the glow of winter lanterns, and Clara Whitmore felt the evening exhale at last. The orchestra packed away their instruments with careful hands, the echo of strings fading into memory. And the vast ballroom that had once magnified her humiliation now held only softened light and scattered reflections across polished marble. Duke. Julian Ashford remained at her side without urgency, without spectacle, as though the most extraordinary decision of the night were simply the beginning of an ordinary truth. Outside, the snow continued to fall in quiet sheets over the 12 acres of Whitmore land, settling over rooftops and bare trees with patient grace. Clara stepped toward the tall windows once more, her breath leaving a faint trace against the glass. And for a moment she allowed herself to look at the estate not as a responsibility but as a chapter that had demanded everything she possessed. Julian joined her without speaking, his presence steady rather than overwhelming. "It is different now," he said gently. "Yes," she answered, "not because of what they think, but because of what I no longer believe about myself." He studied her profile in the reflection, the calm strength that had always existed beneath society's narrow definitions. "There will be invitations, interviews, and expectations," he said quietly. "I do not want you to feel overshadowed." Clara turned toward him fully, her gaze unwavering. "I have lived in shadow long enough to understand it. What I seek is not the absence of it, but the choice to step forward when I wish." A subtle warmth entered his expression. "Then we will ensure that every step forward is yours." Footsteps approached behind them, hesitant and uncertain. Madeline stood several feet away, her earlier sharpness replaced by something closer to disbelief. "Aunt Clara," she began, the title no longer spoken with condescension but with fragile uncertainty, "I did not realize." Clara faced her calmly. "That is precisely the point. Realization rarely arrives until it is forced." Charlotte lingered behind her sister, eyes lowered. "We thought you were content," she murmured. Clara's voice remained steady. "Contentment and endurance are not the same." The words did not accuse. They clarified. Madeline swallowed, her posture shrinking beneath the weight of recognition. "I suppose we underestimated you." Clara's expression softened without yielding. "You underestimated yourself by believing worth must always be loud." The sisters exchanged a glance, their confidence reshaped into humility. Julian observed in silence, understanding that this reconciliation belonged to Clara alone. After a moment, Madeline inclined her head slightly, a gesture small but genuine. "We wish you happiness." Clara accepted the sentiment without triumph. "Happiness is not granted, it is chosen, and tonight I chose." The sisters retreated quietly, leaving the space between past and future unmistakably altered. Julian extended his arm once more, not as a symbol of dominance, but of partnership. "Shall we?" he asked softly. Clara placed her hand upon his sleeve, steady and certain. "Yes," she replied, and as they stepped toward the grand doors beneath the fading glow of crystal light, she felt neither rescued nor elevated, but aligned. The story that had once confined her had not been rewritten by spectacle. It had been transformed by clarity, and in the quiet snowfall beyond the estate's gates, Clara Whitmore walked forward not as the overlooked figure of a family narrative, but as the deliberate author of her own. The grand doors closed softly behind them, muting the last echoes of conversation, and the winter night received Clara Whitmore and Duke Julian Ashford with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The air carried a clean bite of cold, the snow drifting down in patient spirals across the long drive that stretched nearly 300 feet toward the wrought iron gates, and lantern light pooled in warm circles along the path. Clara paused at the top of the stone steps, her breath visible in the hush, and looked back once at the tall windows of the ballroom where silhouettes still moved in fading patterns. For years, she had watched life unfold from the edges of rooms like that, measured in obligations and quiet corrections. But tonight she stood outside it by choice. Julian remained beside her without urging her forward, understanding that departure required its own acknowledgment. "You may return here whenever you wish," he said softly. "This estate will always carry your imprint." Clara nodded, her gaze steady on the snow settling over 12 acres she had defended with ledgers instead of applause. "I did not protect it to possess it," she replied. "I protected it so it would endure." Endurance is a form of love, he answered. She turned toward him then, studying the man who had chosen clarity over convenience. And what do you seek from this union? She asked quietly, not from doubt, but from honesty. Julian did not hesitate. I seek a partner whose strength is not dependent on my name. I seek a woman who speaks truth even when silence is easier. I seek you. The simplicity of his words held more weight than any elaborate vow. Clara felt the final threads of hesitation loosen, not because her life would become effortless, but because it would become shared. A carriage waited at the base of the steps, its dark frame outlined against the pale snowfall, horses steady and calm. The driver looked ahead respectfully, granting them privacy. Clara descended the steps slowly, her gloved hand resting lightly against the stone balustrade polished by generations before her. Each step carried memory, yet none held her back. At the final stair, she paused once more, turning toward Julian with a measured breath. I will not abandon who I have been, she said. He offered his arm with quiet assurance. I would not ask you to. Who you have been is precisely who I admire. She placed her hand upon his sleeve, feeling the warmth of partnership rather than protection. Together they crossed the short distance to the waiting carriage, boots and heels leaving faint impressions in fresh snow that would vanish by morning. As the carriage door opened, and she stepped inside, Clara glanced once more at the estate rising behind them, its windows glowing like distant stars. She did not feel erased from it. She felt completed by it. Julian joined her, the door closing with a soft, decisive sound. The horses began to move, wheels turning steadily along the snow-covered drive. Through the small window, Clara watched the gates approach, then open, and she understood that this crossing was not an escape, but a continuation. Beside her, Julian's presence remained calm and resolute. Outside, the winter night stretched wide and unmarked, and Clara Whitmore did not fear its uncertainty. She welcomed it, because for the first time in her life, the path ahead belonged not to expectation, nor to obligation, but to choice. The carriage wheels rolled steadily along the snow-covered road, the soft rhythm echoing through the quiet interior as Clara Whitmore watched the Whitmore estate disappear beyond a curtain of falling white, its glowing windows fading into the winter night. She did not feel loss. She felt release. Beside her, Duke Julian Ashford sat with composed stillness, not crowding her thoughts, not filling the silence with unnecessary assurances. The space between them was not awkward. It was intentional. After several moments, he spoke gently. The world will attempt to define this night in its own way. They will call it bold, reckless, strategic. Clara's reflection shimmered faintly in the small carriage window as she answered. Let them. They have defined me for years without asking. Tonight I defined myself. The certainty in her tone carried neither defiance nor arrogance, only clarity. Julian inclined his head, studying her with quiet admiration. You understand that life beside me will not always be gentle. My name carries expectation. Scrutiny follows where I go. Clara turned toward him fully, the soft lantern light outlining the calm strength in her expression. I have endured scrutiny without protection. I do not fear it with partnership. His gaze softened at the word partnership. He repeated it as though committing it to something deeper than memory. The carriage passed beneath rows of bare oak trees lining the half-mile stretch toward the main road, their branches arching overhead like silent witnesses. Clara folded her hands in her lap, considering the weight of what lay ahead. I will not become ornamental, she said quietly. I will continue to manage, to advise, to act. He did not hesitate. I would expect nothing less. I asked you to stand beside me because you are formidable, not because you are decorative. The faintest smile touched her lips. That is fortunate. I have never excelled at decoration. He allowed himself a restrained laugh, warm and brief. The horses slowed as the carriage reached the open gates, the ironwork standing tall against the pale landscape. Clara watched as they passed through, the estate grounds officially behind them now, and felt an unfamiliar steadiness settle within her chest. She was not being taken away from her past. She was carrying its lessons forward. Julian extended his hand across the narrow space between them, palm open, not commanding. Clara placed her gloved fingers in his without hesitation. Outside, the snowfall softened, revealing a stretch of open road leading toward Ashford Hall, nearly 20 miles away, where new responsibilities would wait. She did not imagine perfection, she imagined effort. Shared. She did not imagine admiration. She imagined respect earned daily. The carriage continued into the quiet expanse, lantern light cutting through the dark like a measured promise. Clara rested back against the velvet seat, her heart steady, her mind clear. She had once been the silent foundation of a family that rarely acknowledged her strength. Now she was the chosen partner of a man who recognized it before the world did. And as the winter night unfolded ahead of them, she understood a truth far greater than spectacle or status. Worth does not increase when others notice it. It endures when one finally refuses to hide it. And sometimes, the most powerful transformation is not when the world kneels, but when a quiet heart stands and accepts its own value.